Operation Chrome Dome was never supposed to be remembered by the public. For more than a decade during the Cold War, it operated quietly, continuously, and almost invisibly, yet it placed the United States closer to accidental nuclear war than any deliberate enemy action ever did. Beginning in the early 1960s, the U.S. Air Force kept armed nuclear bombers in the sky 24 hours a day, every day, flying predetermined routes near the borders of the Soviet Union. These aircraft were not carrying test weapons or inactive payloads. They carried fully functional thermonuclear bombs, each with destructive power far exceeding Hiroshima. The logic behind the program was simple and terrifying. If the Soviet Union launched a surprise nuclear attack, at least some American bombers would already be airborne and able to retaliate immediately. Deterrence depended not on restraint, but on constant readiness. Inside Strategic Air Command, Chrome Dome was considered a technical solution to a strategic fear. Missiles in silos could be destroyed on the ground, but bombers in the air could not. Crews trained relentlessly to treat nuclear flight as routine. They ate meals, slept in shifts, and followed checklists designed to remove emotion from a mission that, if ever executed, would end civilization. Over time, this normalization became its own danger. The longer the operation continued, the more invisible its risks became to those authorizing it. Each bomber carried multiple safety systems intended to prevent accidental detonation. The weapons were designed so that a crash alone should not trigger a nuclear explosion, but should not was not the same as could not. These aircraft flew in harsh weather, over oceans, through refueling maneuvers at altitude, often at night. Mechanical failure was not hypothetical, it was expected, and when failure occurred, it occurred with live nuclear weapons on board. The American public knew almost nothing about this. Even many members of Congress were unaware of how often nuclear bombs were being flown over friendly territory. Chrome Dome flights crossed the Atlantic, the Arctic, and parts of North America. In several cases, bombers crashed or broke apart mid-air. Conventional explosives inside nuclear weapons detonated in some accidents, scattering radioactive material. In others, bombs were lost entirely. Each incident was quietly classified, contained, and buried beneath layers of secrecy. What made Chrome Dome uniquely dangerous was not hostile intent, but human and mechanical fallibility operating at a global scale. A single navigation error, a faulty switch, a misunderstood signal could have turned a deterrence patrol into a nuclear catastrophe without any enemy involvement. Pilots were trained to follow orders, not to question the broader system. Engineers trusted safeguards that had never been tested under real crash conditions. Commanders assumed that probability was on their side. By the mid-1960s, the United States was flying dozens of nuclear weapons over the planet every day. Each flight represented an unacknowledged gamble. The system assumed perfection in a world where perfection does not exist. And while the Cold War is often remembered for moments when leaders nearly chose war, Operation Chrome Dome represents something far more unsettling. A period when nuclear annihilation could have begun without a decision at all. What follows is not a story of intention, but of proximity, not of ideology, but of physics, timing, and error. Because during Operation Chrome Dome, the question was never whether nuclear war would be authorized. The question was whether it might happen by accident first. The danger of Operation Chrome Dome stopped being theoretical on January 24, 1961, near the small farming community of Goldsboro, North Carolina. A B-52 Stratofortress, part of the Airborne Nuclear Alert Force, began to break apart mid-air after a structural failure during flight. As the aircraft disintegrated, 2 thermonuclear bombs separated from the plane and fell toward the ground. These were not dummy weapons. Each bomb carried a yield hundreds of times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. What followed was one of the closest brushes with accidental nuclear detonation in human history. As the first bomb fell, its arming sequence activated exactly as if it had been intentionally released in wartime. Its parachute deployed, slowing its descent. Several of its safety mechanisms failed one by one. Later investigations would reveal that 3 of the 4 safeguards designed to prevent detonation had been bypassed by the physics of the fall. Only a single low-voltage switch stood between North Carolina and a nuclear explosion. That switch, by chance rather than design, remained in the safe position. Had it flipped, a full-scale nuclear detonation would have occurred on American soil. The second bomb fell differently. It plunged directly into a muddy field and buried itself deep underground. Parts of it were recovered, but critical components were never retrieved. To this day, portions of that nuclear weapon remain somewhere beneath the farmland. The incident was immediately classified. Local residents were told almost nothing. Cleanup crews removed contaminated soil quietly, and official statements minimized the danger. Internally, however, the reality was unmistakable. A single mechanical failure during a routine deterrence flight had nearly triggered a nuclear disaster without any hostile action. The Goldsboro incident was not unique. It was simply the most extreme example. Over the course of Operation Chrome Dome, multiple bombers experienced crashes, mid-air collisions, fires, and emergency landings while carrying live nuclear weapons. In 1966, a B-52 collided with a refueling aircraft over Spain, dropping 4 hydrogen bombs near the town of Palomares. 2 of the weapon's conventional explosives detonated on impact, spreading radioactive material across the countryside. Another bomb fell into the Mediterranean Sea and was recovered only after an intense, months-long search. Each accident exposed a dangerous truth. The safeguards designed to prevent nuclear detonation were never meant to operate under real-world crash conditions. They were theoretical, tested in controlled environments, and trusted because they had never failed catastrophically before. Chrome Dome relied on probability, not certainty. It assumed that accidents would be survivable, that systems would fail gracefully, and that luck would always intervene at the final moment. Inside the military, debates quietly intensified. Engineers warned that repeated airborne alerts multiplied risk with no added strategic benefit. Commanders, however, feared that ending the program would signal weakness to the Soviet Union. Deterrence had become a performance, and performance demanded visibility, even if that visibility existed only in classified planning rooms. By the late 1960s, it was becoming clear that the greatest nuclear threat facing the United States was not an incoming Soviet missile, but its own bombers circling the globe. The system designed to prevent surprise attack was creating countless opportunities for irreversible error. Chrome Dome was not failing because it was misused. It was failing because it worked exactly as intended. And still, the flights continued. As Operation Chrome Dome continued, the United States found itself trapped by the very logic it had created. Ending the airborne alert program was no longer a simple military decision. It had become a political and psychological one. Strategic Air Command believed that constant nuclear presence in the sky signaled resolve to the Soviet Union. Any reduction, they feared, could be interpreted as hesitation, weakness, or loss of credibility. Deterrence, in this framework, depended not only on weapons, but on routine. The bombers had to keep flying because they always had. Behind closed doors, however, the risks were becoming impossible to ignore. Accident reports accumulated. Maintenance logs showed increasing mechanical strain on aging aircraft, forced to remain operational far beyond normal expectations. Crews rotated constantly, but fatigue was unavoidable. Refueling errors, navigation deviations, and communication failures became common enough to be expected, yet each carried the same potential consequence. Every mistake happened with nuclear weapons on board. One of the most disturbing realities of Chrome Dome was how close authority over nuclear war came to individual crews. While final launch orders remained centralized, the physical custody of thermonuclear weapons rested in the hands of pilots flying thousands of meters above the Earth. Emergency protocols existed for nearly every imaginable scenario, but war planners had underestimated the complexity of real emergencies. Fires did not follow manuals, structural failures did not respect checklists, and once a bomber was compromised, decisions had to be made in seconds, not hours. In several incidents, crews were forced to choose between crashing with weapons on board or attempting risky landings at bases never designed to receive armed nuclear aircraft in distress. Each choice carried unacceptable outcomes. These were not acts of bravery celebrated in public. They were moments quietly erased from history, documented only in classified reports and technical annexes. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, was only partially aware of the scale of Chrome Dome. Intelligence estimates suggested that Moscow knew American bombers were frequently airborne, but not how often or how many carried live weapons. This uncertainty increased the danger. A bomber appearing unexpectedly on radar, even unintentionally, could be misinterpreted as the first wave of a nuclear strike. In a climate already saturated with paranoia, misreading intent could have triggered retaliation. This fear was not theoretical. Both superpowers operated under launch-on-warning doctrines. Decisions about nuclear response were measured in minutes. A false alarm, a radar glitch, or an unidentified aircraft could collapse the distance between peace and annihilation. Chrome Dome added constant noise to an already unstable system. It increased the number of moments when the wrong interpretation could end everything. By the end of the 1960s, critics inside the U.S. government began to acknowledge a grim truth. Operation Chrome Dome did not merely protect against accidental war, it actively created new pathways to it. The United States had placed nuclear weapons into continuous motion, trusting that technology, discipline, and probability would always hold. But probability, by definition, fails eventually. The question was no longer whether Chrome Dome was dangerous. The question was how long the country could continue relying on luck before it ran out.
The breaking point for Operation Chrome Dome did not come from a single catastrophic failure, but from a growing realization inside the U.S. defense establishment that the program's risks now outweighed its strategic value. By the late 1960s, advances in intercontinental ballistic missiles had changed the balance of nuclear deterrence. Land-based missiles could be launched within minutes, reducing the original justification for keeping bombers constantly airborne. What remained was a legacy system sustained more by institutional inertia than necessity. This shift became undeniable in 1968. Another B-52 crashed near Thule Air Base in Greenland while on airborne alert. The aircraft caught fire and broke apart over ice, scattering nuclear weapon components and radioactive material across a frozen landscape. Although no nuclear detonation occurred, the cleanup operation was massive, dangerous, and impossible to conceal from allies. Denmark, which governed Greenland, had officially declared itself a nuclear-free zone. The presence of American nuclear weapons there triggered political outrage and diplomatic fallout. Internally, the Thule crash forced senior officials to confront what had been quietly understood for years. Chrome Dome was not just a military risk, it was a geopolitical liability. Each accident carried the potential to fracture alliances, provoke public backlash, and expose the United States as reckless rather than responsible. Secrecy could no longer fully contain the consequences. At the same time, analysts reevaluated the assumption that airborne bombers truly increased deterrence. Simulations showed that accidental loss of a bomber could create escalatory pressures equal to or greater than a deliberate attack. A crash near Soviet territory or a bomber straying off course during a crisis might have forced Moscow to respond before clarification was possible. In such scenarios, the United States would lose control of escalation entirely. In 1968, the decision was made to quietly end continuous airborne nuclear alerts. The change was not announced with speeches or press conferences. Flights were gradually reduced, then stopped altogether. Nuclear bombers would remain on alert on the ground instead, ready to launch if ordered, but no longer circling the globe with live weapons day and night. Officially, Chrome Dome faded away. Unofficially, it left behind unanswered questions about how close the world had come to disaster. What made Operation Chrome Dome uniquely unsettling was not that it failed, but that it nearly succeeded too well. For years, the system operated without triggering catastrophe, reinforcing confidence in its design. But hindsight revealed a different reality. The absence of disaster was not proof of safety, it was evidence of narrow escape. The Cold War is often remembered through moments of deliberate brinkmanship, where leaders weighed options in crisis rooms. Chrome Dome represents a different kind of danger. It shows how systems built for stability can quietly accumulate risk, how normalization of extreme measures dulls awareness, and how catastrophe can emerge not from hostile intent, but from routine operations carried out long enough. By the time the program ended, the United States had unknowingly run one of the most prolonged and dangerous experiments in nuclear history. It did not explode, it did not trigger war, but it proved beyond doubt how fragile control truly was. In the years that followed the quiet end of Operation Chrome Dome, its true significance remained buried under classification and public ignorance. The United States moved on to newer doctrines, more advanced missiles, and increasingly automated systems of deterrence. Yet the legacy of Chrome Dome lingered inside military and academic circles as a warning that was rarely spoken aloud. The program demonstrated that nuclear catastrophe did not require political intent, ideological confrontation, or even enemy action. It could emerge from routine, repetition, and trust in systems never meant to operate indefinitely. Declassified documents later revealed how narrowly disaster had been avoided on multiple occasions. Investigators reviewing the Goldsboro incident concluded that the weapon had progressed through nearly its entire arming sequence. The final safety switch that prevented detonation was not reinforced, not redundant, and not designed as the ultimate barrier. It survived because of chance. Similar reviews of other accidents showed that safety mechanisms were often misunderstood by those relying on them. Engineers assumed layers of protection that, under real-world stress, collapsed into single points of failure. What made this especially dangerous was the illusion of control. Strategic planners believed they were managing risk through discipline and procedure. In reality, they were dispersing that risk across geography and time. Every additional flight multiplied exposure. Every successful mission reinforced confidence that failure would not occur. This feedback loop pushed caution further into the background until it became abstract. Chrome Dome also exposed a deeper flaw in Cold War deterrence thinking. Stability was pursued through constant escalation readiness. Peace depended on weapons being closer to use, not farther from it. This logic assumed rational actors and flawless systems. It left little room for randomness, human error, or mechanical decay.
When accidents happened, they were treated as anomalies instead of signals. The end of airborne nuclear alerts did not eliminate the danger of accidental war, it merely shifted it. Missiles replaced bombers, automation replaced human presence. But Chrome Dome remained unique in one respect. It placed the instruments of annihilation into motion continuously, trusting that motion itself was safe. No other nuclear strategy relied so heavily on luck while pretending it relied on control. For historians, Operation Chrome Dome stands apart from famous Cold War crises because nothing visibly happened. No ultimatum was issued, no missile was launched, no leader made a dramatic decision, and yet the cumulative risk may have exceeded that of any single confrontation. The world survived not because the system was sound, but because it did not fail at the worst possible moment. This realization reframes how nuclear history is understood. The most dangerous moments are not always marked by alarms and speeches. Sometimes they unfold silently over years, hidden in routine. Chrome Dome was one of those moments. It did not bring the world to the brink in a single night. It kept the world there quietly every day.
Operation Chrome Dome ultimately forces a reconsideration of how history measures danger. When people think about moments when the world nearly ended, they imagine countdowns, speeches, and visible crises. What Chrome Dome reveals is far more unsettling. For more than a decade, the United States normalized a condition in which nuclear destruction was not a remote possibility, but a constant background risk. The system did not rely on a single dramatic failure. It relied on thousands of successful repetitions, never going wrong at the same time. The program survived because each flight that ended safely reinforced the belief that the next one would as well. This created a form of strategic blindness. Risk became invisible precisely because it was continuous. Leaders evaluated danger through isolated incidents rather than cumulative exposure. Each accident was treated as manageable. Each near miss was classified, analyzed, and then absorbed back into routine. Over time, this approach made catastrophe statistically inevitable, even if it never occurred. What saved the world was not superior design or flawless discipline, but the gradual recognition that deterrence itself had limits. By the late Cold War, policymakers began to understand that systems built on constant readiness create their own momentum, one that becomes difficult to stop. Chrome Dome was abandoned not because it failed spectacularly, but because it revealed too clearly how little margin for error truly existed. The lessons of the program extend beyond its era. Modern nuclear forces rely even more heavily on automation, early warning systems, and rapid decision cycles. The assumption that technology reduces risk echoes the same confidence once placed in airborne alerts. Chrome Dome shows that safety mechanisms cannot eliminate uncertainty. They can only shift where it hides. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Operation Chrome Dome is how easily it faded from memory. There were no memorials, no public reckoning, no widespread debate. The near disasters it created were locked away, rediscovered only decades later through declassified documents and investigative reporting. This absence of consequence allowed similar assumptions to persist into the present. Chrome Dome did not almost start a nuclear war in the traditional sense. It did something more dangerous. It made nuclear war possible without intent. It transformed the greatest weapons ever built into routine cargo, trusted to gravity, switches, and human fatigue. The Cold War ended without those weapons detonating by accident, but that outcome was never guaranteed. In the end, Operation Chrome Dome stands as a reminder that the most catastrophic failures in history are often the ones no one plans for.
They emerge from systems that work too well for too long until the cost of a single error becomes absolute. The world survived Chrome Dome not because it was safe, but because chance intervened repeatedly. That may be the most fragile foundation peace has ever rested on.